Thank you very much. Okay, so one of the most important novels ever written in Brazil by Machado de Assis, Dom Casmurro, has one of the main characters, somebody who is writing his biography and who claims all the time to have lapses of memory. So I will try today to help us not to have too many lapses in the future and remember a few of the things as I do remember them. And I also suffer from lapses of memory, so I might remember things wrong. But I went into deep research about history in my own hard disk. So I will present things as I remember them and as they are registered in the history in which I took part. Okay, so I would like to talk today about what the LFIs could have been. But I will spend a lot of time on prolegomena, on how things happened. So I will not talk as much as I would like to on what they could have been. Okay, the birth of the LFIs. The girl came to watch me, so I had to pay tribute to her. Okay, so I would like to discuss a little bit about this discovery or invention of, say, America. As everybody knows, America was discovered by Columbus. Well, at least everybody outside of Brazil. Because in Brazil, there is a different discovery. We do not commemorate and we have absolutely no idea when America was discovered. There is no Dia de la Raza. There is no commemoration of the discovery of America, official holiday or something like this. So it pretty much depends on who is looking. Right? If you want to know what's the interest. So, you have other versions also of the discovery of America. I'm not going into that. Let's talk about the airplane. The airplane, as everybody knows, was invented by the Wright brothers, right? Not here in Brazil. Here it was invented by Santos Dumont, who did this in front of everybody in France. So actually, one could have a good claim for him having done this before. But if you go to India, there is somebody else that invented it before and flew much before Santos Dumont. And in Germany also, there is somebody who flew before. But they claim that it's not an airplane, it's a glider. So you have all these kind of distinctions of what you mean by airplane when you're talking about the invention of the airplane. The telephone. When I went to Firenze in Italy, I was very much surprised when I was walking on the street and then I found a sign that said that it commemorated the discovery or the invention of the telephone by, of course, Antonio Meucci. Right? So the Italian inventor of the telephone. Actually, it's not a telephone, it's a teletrophone. Right? But it's supposed to do the same thing. And obviously I had to go to Wikipedia in Italian because the one in English is so biased towards Graham Bell. And in English you find things like this that will, this guy claims to have done something before, but we know very well that it was Graham Bell that did it. Okay, corruption. I thought that Brazil had invented it. Or at least we excelled in it, right? So I thought it was ours, but then I discovered that it was invented in Europe. Come on, you can read this in English and German. So apparently it was written by a Dutch, but apparently it was invented in Europe. And as we all know, there is no sin beneath the equator, so how could it have been invented in Brazil? That was an inner joke, for those who know what I'm mentioning there. Okay, so paraconsistent logics, invented, of course, in Brazil, came from this pioneering work by Newton da Costa. This is the original version of the work, and 1963 is the year of the publication of this thesis. And in page 5, the introduction to the thesis, Newton da Costa says that he knows and has heard about some questionings by Jaśkowski on the topic 15 years before, and he had heard about Nelson, which has a different orientation than his, and that's it. That's what he says about this topic. But he recognizes that these things existed and he had heard about them in his original publication. There was there were some claims that he had done this several years before, and he himself said that he had worked on this in between 54 and 58. He even mentions here 58. These are two papers in Portuguese in which he just discusses the philosophy of inconsistency. There is no operating system in those papers. But there is one paper from 1962, which is here. This is the full paper. It's an abstract that he presented for the Society for the Progress of Science, the Brazilian Society for the Progress of Science, and it was in Portuguese, of course, and this translation was produced for the first time in my thesis in 2005, and he mentions the C things, C calculus, right? It's not in there, there are no axioms in there, but he mentions that he had already thought about this. Of course, he's going to deliver a thesis the next year, so he's been working on it, right? So he has already given names to it, and maybe a good name, maybe a bad name, but there is C everywhere. And it's not C for Carnielli in this case. Okay. So Newton da Costa. As I just put here the first publication, there are hundreds of publications. The one most cited is this one from 1974. So in some sense, well, it's the first one in English that circulates widely. Before it was in Portuguese and French in the 60s, and this one is very much cited, as you see, so it's very influential, if that counts as influential. And most people still cite this, and in many cases just for historical matters, but a lot of people cite this often. Now, logics of formal inconsistency, which are particular cases, particular examples of paraconsistent logics, were again invented in Brazil, perhaps. Let's see if they were. Just to mention these papers, which are the ones which are the most cited in the area. The name formal inconsistency appears for the first time in the title in this paper from 2000. So maybe we should commemorate 15 years this year. It's the first time it appears in a paper. And then this one appears much later, but the main paper in the area is the taxonomy of this system. The inaugurational paper in the area was this one, which was published in 2002. But the history of that paper starts a little bit before. So let me tell you a little bit about this history. So the one true story, of course. It comes from me, so it should be the one true story. Please, it's not for serious. So it's just my version of the story, right? But let me remind what happened 15 years ago. We had the Second World Congress on Paraconsistency in Brazil, which was, as we all know, the best conference ever. At least Graham Priest told me so last year. So it should be right. He told me that it was the best conference he has ever been in his life. And I cannot but agree with him. I was planning to do a better one this year, but I failed miserably. But thanks for coming anyway. So it finished on the Friday, 12th of May, with two talks, one in which I mentioned the problem of maximality by da Costa and a more general solution to this problem, and then one by Carnielli, jointly co-authored by myself, on the paleontology and futurology of the systems. So what was inside this talk? If you ask us today, we would say LFIs are inside this talk. They were not inside this talk. So let me mention what's in there. In January of that year, we produced an abstract in which there is no mention of a consistency connective. And actually we propose a marvelous and magic system called C!, which we never published because it was not that magical after all. But it was our idea that we could solve things by proposing one new system. Excellent, better than all the rest. So this is what in the abstract. And then the slides that were ready 2 days before we presented do not mention anything like LFIs, but they do introduce the system BC, which some of you might know, classical logic plus something else. Positive classical logic plus something else related to the consistency connective. And negation. Anyway, I'm not going to mention any specific system in this talk. So if you know, excellent. If you don't, you would be interested in knowing what this system is, and it does have a consistency connective. And we do talk about the recovery of classical logic, which is the main feature of these systems. The idea that you can recover classical reasoning from inside those systems. So this is mentioned in the talk that closes the conference, and we had some notes that were written a little bit before the talk, and I have several versions of these notes in my computer. And in March that year, I had some notes that mentioned the ecology of inconsistency. It was changing to taxonomy, but I wanted to make it something biology related because money was on biology, so we wanted to make it something genetically modified, whatever. It was ecology, then it turned into taxonomy later on. But at that moment, we had very different terminology. For instance, we called what we would later call bottom particles, or sometimes called bottom elements. We called them strong inconsistencies. We had a definition of a gifted paraconsistent logic, which was a paraconsistent logic having a strong negation. This disappeared before any publication. It has never been published. But this is the main definition there, because a C system is defined as a gifted paraconsistent logic that extends some positive fragment of some given logic. So it's not about consistency. It's about having strong negation. That's what's in there. And later on, we had some more full plans for what the paper would be, and this is in my hard drive at the beginning of September. There is a very consistent version of what the paper would become, and this was shortly, maybe 2 or 3 days before I left for exile in Germany and other places. So I left for a long time, and the rest happened with me outside of Brazil, and with us discussing by email, me and Carnielli, very excitedly about what this was going to be. So I was in Karlsruhe and at the end of September, in which I have a version in which the LFIs are mentioned for the first time, and in anything that looks like an official draft. And the C systems are defined very loosely as particular LFIs obtained by extensions of the positive fragment of other logics, and the DC systems as C systems in which you can get rid of those balls by using other connectives. So very loosely defined, but the ideas are there in September of 2000. So if we count this as some official date, then tomorrow is the day of commemorating 15 years, and I hope you all clap your hands tomorrow for this birth that happened 15 years ago. Anyway, after this, I was told that in Germany, the warmest place that existed was Karlsruhe, but for me it was very cold, and it was my first winter actually in my life, and I decided to go to Rimini, where I met a true dialetheia. I saw snow on the beach. Very sad idea of going to Italy, but that was where I threw everything away and decided to restart, because I was getting tired of our notes and I couldn't understand any longer. I think it was all wrong, so I decided to restart writing everything, because I couldn't go to the beach, of course. Then there was the most important section, in my opinion, of the paper, which is the section in which I discussed several versions of logical principles, was written while I was there spending my Christmas and New Year. And then I started also to draw a map of the territory, because there was so much going on, so much happening, that at the end, this map had 11 pages just showing where the theorems were and where they were referred and what we used them for. So it started to grow at that time in that sorrowful December in Rimini. But shortly after this, I had to come back to Brazil, and I had no grant, and I was kindly invited to move to Belgium. So I went to Belgium in the middle of the carnival, and I arrived to a house that had no heating and no warm water, and I lost my carnival not to be able to take showers. But that was the place where I would develop the rest of it. What would become, together with Carnielli, far away in a very cozy, nice environment, I'm sure, this 94-page paper with 111 bibliographic references, which I did read all and commented upon all of them. And we got the reports from 5 referees, and we wrote a 40-page covering letter to respond all the things that they have written to us. So thanks to all of them for their effort. I'm going to mention and disclose here some of the things that they wrote to us at the time. The publication actually happened in January 2002. And then I started cruising the world telling people about the good news, right? My name is João and Marcos. These are two evangelists, and that's what they do. They cross the world and tell people about this. I especially like to go to places where, like Amsterdam, in which people were hostile to the idea, but they liked to hear that I was trying to do something like hybrid logics did, internalizing some meta-theoretical notion inside the logical, inside the language, the object level language of a logic. So I went to several places in that 2002. In not all of them I talked about the same thing. Actually, I only repeated once the same talk in the whole year. So let me just do this indiscretion of disclosing some things that the 5 referees wrote to us at the time. So referee number 1 from Australia. You can imagine who, but you might be wrong. Important person from Australia. I know who he is. We know all the referees because we were asked to choose the referees. But they were hard. Of course, I chose only the best things to show to you here, right? But they were very hard on us, so that we had to write this 40-page covering letter. But some things were good, like, for instance, highlighting the importance of having made the distinction between contradiction and consistency, and saying that we had a lot of distinctions, but even though the guy was skeptical at the end, he said it works, there is an interesting philosophy throughout the paper, and especially this one I like. I very much like this comment. Okay, the second referee from Belgium did not like the jokes. And I was living there, right? So you can imagine life, but I was very well received, and I heartily thank him for producing the largest report, 12 pages report that we received. So you see, for instance, that he doesn't like so much my style. I wonder why he thinks it's my style. I should blame the other co-author, but...
everybody knows.
Anyway, he does say something.
The referees know who knows the author.
Yes, they do, yes. Anyway, he recognizes that, he or she recognizes that these systems cover a much broader domain than Da Costa had in mind. And I like this last thing here. He says that, well, you see, the systems were called CN, and he doesn't like that I choose the name C to talk about C systems. And he says he would have chosen a different letter because we do such a more general approach that the choice of C to name the systems will actually seem to correct Da Costa rather than honoring him. And he was right. We were intending to honor, but also to correct, also to extend, and I don't think there is any contradiction in that, in paying a tribute and making it better for the future, making it better for the future generations, producing work for unknown to use on later years. So he
There were contradictions, shouldn't be worried anyway.
Yes, definitely. Referee number 3 from the US said that it motivates philosophical discussion. Referee number 4 says that it gives a new perspective. This guy is from, who is the guy? Let me remember. The US, and this one is from, okay, this one is from France. And he says, well, Da Costa had already introduced this ball, but you know, your paper is far more general. Great, thanks, he noticed. Referees number 5, which is the last one, this is from England, UK. So this guy was mentioned already at this conference, but I'm not giving you any other hint. He says that we produce this beautiful clarification of the notions of contradiction and consistency. Thanks again. He doesn't have much to criticize. Okay. Let me mention you some things that could have happened then. Some dead ends that we hit in the investigation, some things that we started but had to abandon. Let me briefly mention some of them. Okay, for instance, one of the things we were very much worried about were what we called misnomers. We think that we thought at the time, and we still think, that the names that were used to refer to the logics produced in Brazil were very badly, very ill chosen. And one of these names was positive plus. I have no idea what that means, but I understand that the person wanted to say that, well, these logics extend some positive basis. But positive plus by itself, saying that it is a class of logics produced by the Brazilian paraconsistent school, is very poor. And it's a very bad choice. So it doesn't tell much, especially because this can be found in any other place. This is basically the same thing that people do in many other places. And the other thing that was used by all the Australian school and many other people was just calling the systems C systems, but usually referring by this to the CN systems and only. And there was no definition of what a C system was, and there were several other versions of C systems in the literature already, and it was not clear whether they referred to all of them at once when they used the term C systems or not. But we wanted to produce a definition of something that we could claim to have a specific class, and as Anon showed, it's too broad of a class. But we wanted to give a definition of something that would encompass what was in the literature in these 111 references and so on. And the worst name is Brazilian paraconsistent logics, of course, as if logics had nationality. And the next thing, of course, is to require them to bear a passport, right? Okay. Now, as I have already mentioned, we started with the idea of studying gifted paraconsistent logics. Means paraconsistent logics having a strong negation, having a classical negation. That's what I thought about the strong negation at the time, or a negation that has the property of explosion. And the other thing that was very much interesting us and that we kind of abandoned in the middle was the logics that were dual to constructive logics to intuitionistic logics, because this could have been a way of going on, but we didn't do very much at the time in this direction. Later on, we did propose, and I did coin even a name for these kind of logics, which would be the logics of formal undeterminedness, right? Not about inconsistency, but about undeterminedness. And we wanted to study, as Da Costa did, first order version, set theories, and so on. And this was also left behind because the paper grew so much that we had to choose not to do this at the time. And we thought that the main problem of paraconsistency was not at that level, but at the propositional level. Okay, so some side projects that appeared in the middle. I mentioned this in the abstracts, most of them in the abstracts, so I'll just briefly go through them. All of them are treated in the taxonomy of systems. We not only introduce the systems, but also we propose a way of distinguishing the notion of contradiction from the notion of inconsistency. We propose to study the interaction in between negation and this consistency connective. We propose to study the propagation of consistency whenever you have information about consistency of a certain formula. Does that affect all the formulas? We have a section on the maximal fragments of classical logic in which I presented these 8,192 three-valued logics that were in a draft that was never published so far. 15 years ago. And we did study several classes of those systems, those having interesting many-valued semantics, having interesting and natural modal semantics, and so on. Okay, let me just briefly mention that we do make some comments on the choice of logical primitives, on the things you have in the language. We use the standard classical connectives, but we do comment at some moments that we could have other primitives in the language. And for instance, we discuss very much the degrees of expressiveness of those languages. And the last problem is related to this one, because the last problem is related to algebraizability. And if we had chosen as a primitive by implication, it would turn out that this is the wrong choice if you want to do algebraization for a lot of those systems. So we do not introduce by implication as a primitive in these systems, but I think it could be done. I'm sure it could be done, but we didn't do it at the time. So there was a discussion about whether we should do it or not, but then we abandoned it because of our intention to discuss C algebras. This name never appears in the paper, but we wanted to discuss algebras related to these logics. Okay, so what I think to be one of the main contributions of the paper is this section on the logical principles. And there are several principles mentioned there. And this is the part where the referee said that, well, there's a wealth of distinctions, but they work. We do make a difference. That's the thing that I had to write several times. I had to throw away in Rimini and write again, and so this is the thing that gave me a lot of work. We introduced the notion of the principle of explosion, thanks to Diederik Battens to remembering how is the ablative in Latin. So it's not ex contradictio, it's ex contradictione. And we do show that this principle could be made different from the principle of non-contradiction. There are logics that do not respect our version of non-contradiction, the principle of non-contradiction, but they're called, in our paper, dialectic logics. And most paraconsistent logics, according to our definition, do not disrespect the principle of non-contradiction as it is in the paper. If you're curious about it, read the paper, and you'll see what we mean by these principles. The ex falso, sometimes in literature taken to be synonymous with ex contradictione, in our paper is not. It's related not to explosion, but related to the existence of a bottom particle in the language. And as we have seen today, the bottom particle is good enough to define a consistency connective over a classical positive basis. We do define what it means for a logic to have a strong negation. In this case, it's just to be explosive with respect to that negation. We talk about these controllable versions of explosion, meaning that you don't have explosion for an arbitrary formula, but you have explosion for some particular kinds of formula, like not A. So instead of having A and not A implying everything, you have not A and not A implying everything. So these versions of explosion are there, even though you might not want them to be there. For instance, in the modal version of S5, you have this version, this controllable version of explosion, which you might or might not want to avoid in your logics. I don't have a preferred logic if you want to know about this. So we discussed the idea of partial explosion, which is not deriving everything, but deriving everything which is of a specific format and still not a theorem. Logics that do not do this are called boldly paraconsistent in this paper. In other papers, they're called strictly paraconsistent and so on, but there was such a clash of terminology that we decided to establish a new terminology using this Star Trek slogan of boldly going, where no other logic has gone before. So the partial explosion is one thing you can find, for instance, in constructive logics. In some constructive logics, like Johansson's minimal intuitionistic logic, it trivializes for the negation fragment of the logic when you're in the presence of a contradiction. And there is the notion of a gentle paraconsistency, which was just a name we chose to refer to the things that were the principle that was behind the very idea of a logical formal inconsistency. We thought it was a nice way of going between and beyond difficulties. A difficulty meaning in this case a contradiction. Okay, so it is time for me to mention, of course, the derivability adjustment theorems, because I have already said at least twice that they were the most important thing that we're worried about. And the idea was that if you have an LFI based on a given logic, and you could say that, this is the contrary, sorry. This should be here and vice versa. So the idea is that in an LFI, you can recover some classical or some consistent reasoning by adding a number of consistency assumptions, right? This was one way of realizing this idea of recovering the lost perfection, the lost reasoning from the consistency assumptions that were thrown away by a paraconsistent logic. There are other ways of recovering classical reasoning, and we do talk about them, for instance, in translating classical logic inside the paraconsistent logic by using the strong negation or using some other dirty trick. So there is a way of translating, but we were worried about a general theorem like this, just inverting these positions, in which an LFI could recover classical reasoning by adding consistency assumptions. In the case of the inaugural systems by Newton da Costa, these assumptions could be reduced to a subset of the atomic variables that appeared in the premises because of the propagation of consistency. Okay, another way of using this theorem is by going adaptive, going non-monotonic. The adaptive logics are also based on the same idea, only that these consistency assumptions do not need to be written here because they're taken to be true by default. You assume things to be consistent unless and until proven otherwise. So these terminology of the reliability adjustment theorems I took from Diederik Battens. Thanks again for him to have coined it. And I think that our approach and his approach are based on the same proposal, same goal of recovering classical reasoning in different ways. Okay, so let me briefly mention some alternative histories. How this could have gone. Well, as I said, we have all those logical principles, so why choose to study gentle power consistency? Well, we could have chosen to concentrate on logical systems having a bottom particle. That's what we just saw in the previous invited talk. And it works very well because from there you can define a strong consistency connective. But we didn't do it. We really wanted to give a meaning at that time to this strange ball operator. We wanted to make it an operator actually. It was just an abbreviation, which brings us problems into translating a logic into another. It's not the same thing to have something as a primitive operator or an abbreviation. Anyway, remember the gifted power consistent logics. This was our initial approach. We could have chosen to concentrate on logics having more than one negation. For instance, they could have a power consistent negation and a classical negation, but they could also have a power consistent negation and a power complete negation, just like in Brouwer-Heiting algebras. So we could have said that what interests us is to study logics with several negations, or a negation related to each notion of contradiction, which is they're not equivalent in any power consistent logic. We could have several different negations and non-equivalent negations. That was not what we did, but it was a possible road to be trodden. And the other things which, as I have already mentioned, appeared later on, the logics of formal undeterminedness, could have been our main focus at the time, but we chose not to do it because it was not obvious from the literature that all the logics that we found were dualizing something. They were just proposed by fiat, and we had to give them meaning, so it wasn't a good approach for that moment. There are other papers on this dualization, of course. I myself value and favor the approach using multiple conclusion, in which I think this is much more easy to explain the notion of dualization. Anyway, some topics have not been so well studied as they could have, and I would like to mention them here. For instance, this system BK, with small b in our case, it's the system in which you have this classical notion of consistency. So you have not only the axiom BC, but also the axiom K. And it established a very nice connection in between consistency and the contradiction. So this thing is said to be false whenever the formula is contradictory. So it's if and only if. It's a very nice way of proceeding. We didn't explore that in that first paper as we could. Not even in the second paper, or the third. But Arnaud has called attention to this, and I very much like these systems. And particularly, I like them because all these logics, which are the modal LFIs that I have said later on, they all have this, but they do not have the axiom CI, which I think is very badly chosen, because I think the axiom should be about classical or strong negation, not about power consistent negation. But it was an axiom respected by Newton da Costa, and we had to put it there somewhere, but I don't like it myself. Okay, so I would prefer axiom K, had I thought of it. And these modal LFIs are those in which you have these connective, which I interpreted in other places as a kind of an essence connective, as opposed to a connective for accident. But you could understand as saying that, well, something is inconsistent when it is the case, but it could have been different. And the other thing which is missing in the taxonomy, but it does appear in the handbook chapter, are the minimal conditions for something to be called a negation. So negations, this is iteration of negation. If you put an extra negation, it could be the case that this formula is true while the previous one was false, and vice versa here. So negations should invert something. And you have seen this condition also today in another lecture for m equals 0. So I introduced this in a paper in 2005, and I think it's an important thing to take into account when you say you have this negation symbol, but you don't give criteria for calling it a negation symbol.
João, do you mean it for all phi or exists phi?
Exists. If you formulate with an atomic variable and you have structurality, then this could be written in a different way. Okay, let me finish then by just a brief comment and let you target me on your questions. Maybe we could say that these logics are somehow resistant to changes in the underlying philosophy. As you see, it was very technical so far. Well, what I wanted to comment is that it is not only true, but it's also true about the two co-authors of the original paper. I do not agree with the current approach by Carnielli and Abilio on how to interpret the notion of consistency in this logic. So let me just briefly mention what I mean by this. Personal thing, right? It's my research, so I might disagree. I'm not saying that it's wrong, I just have a different approach. Let me just remember that actually the notion of contradiction being taken too consistently is actually in Jaśkowski, in original paper, 1948. And I think we did realize in our main axiom his idea that things taken too consistently might be dangerous. But let me just remind you, if you open an English dictionary, you might find three meanings of consistency. The first one, related to logical coherence among things. The second one meaning reliability, something that I use this word in this sense in this lecture already, being consistently doing something. And the third one is the one that's most common, most important in my life right now, as a father. But, yes. But of course, the notion of consistency that we use and we're interested upon is this. And the reason I mention it is that I had problems when I went to Portugal. And I used to use the word consistência, and they claimed that it means only number 3. And I said, well, I take it as an Anglicism, as a translation from the English notion consistency, and I will not change the name of paraconsistent logics from paraconsistência to paracoherência. It's too late to do this. Okay, so it remained, and it's take it as this new Anglicism, and consistência has now the first meaning also in Portuguese. And let me just mention then briefly what I announced. Abilio has nicely shown that you could have an approach to the notion of consistency and try to explain logics of full inconsistency by using an epistemic interpretation in terms of evidence preservation. I do not subscribe to that explanation because I was never able to make sense of it. I was never able to make sense of what it means to have too much of a good thing, or to have too much information, or to have evidence about the something being some formula needing to be accepted and its negation also being accepted. So I don't think paraconsistent logic needs to be interpreted by this glut on acceptance. I would rather put this in terms of a gap, in terms of rejection. You have a formula and its negation taken seriously in your premises when you have no reason to reject either. And if acceptance and rejection are not the complements of each other, the two explanations are not equivalent. And I rather prefer the second one, which I nowadays explain in terms of a doxastic approach and use the words cognitive attitudes to explain and translate the problem of truth and falsity to problems about acceptance and rejection of given piece of data. But I'm not going to tell you more about this. Let me just throw it as a token of the possibility of having different interpretations for the same systems, different philosophical interpretation for the same systems. And in my approach, it's so radical that I would even throw away the notion of truth and falsity. And you might throw stones at me because of this. Anyway, Da Costa had already said in 59 that everything that's non-trivial is admissible, so maybe what I'm doing here is admissible. This is not The end. Thank you very much.
Questions? Comments? I have a comment.
Microphone.
I think it's very important. Thank you for the very nice presentation. Very nice in all aspects. But I think it's worth mentioning one important point where Da Costa insists, where he has insisted, that he says that for a consistent logic should preserve classical logic as much as it can. So I think Marcelo and I think you might agree with that, Abilio agrees with that. We think that this was not very precise. So what's really important is that classical logic, part of consistent logic, should be able to code classical, not to preserve bits of classical reasoning, but to quote, to be able to encode classical reasoning. That's a big difference.
It is, and actually, but the requirement that it should have be a maximal fragment only appears in 1974. It is not in any of the original papers by Da Costa. It appears only then, and he himself disobeyed this maximum because he works on these systems CN, and none of them are maximal fragments. So, fortunately, he himself proposed all the systems which were maximal. He studied together with Italo Ottaviano, a system which already had been in the literature for many years with other names, and they didn't know, which is called by many other names like Cluns or J3 or whatever in the name it's called in the book of Schutte from 1960. That system is maximal. It's proposed by Da Costa. It disobeys one of his axioms that says that the negation of A not A should not be a theorem, because it is in this system. Disobey his own maximum. And this system, according to our approach, was for the first time characterized as a relative of the CN, because it is an LFI. The first place where it appears as having similarity with the other systems. There was something common in them, is that, and what we thought was common in them, and we still believe, is that they can internalize this notion of consistency.
João, since you're talking about the history, so one mystery that you didn't explain. Why it's called logic of formal inconsistency? Well, if defined by, why it's not a consistency operator?
I can explain.
So why not LFC, unless you wanted to, in the name, to be inconsistent?
No, I can explain. I have a head, at the time, a co-author, who is a compulsive inventor of terminology. I'm not telling you who, but this person invented and coined the word, the term formal inconsistency in this paper. And then we got stuck with it. We didn't have the definition of LFI in that paper. We had a particular example, two particular examples of LFIs in that paper, but no definition in that paper. And the term that we used was formal inconsistency. We actually called the systems LFI1 and LFI2, and then we got stuck with it. But it does have the consistency also there as well. Yes.
But in your PhD, there is a parenthesis, it's consistent or inconsistent.
Is there?
Yeah.
I can erase it. Can I erase it?
Well, I'm not sure.
Too late.
If in your PhD it is somewhere,
Too late.
There's a parenthetical remark
I hate these parentheses. May I erase them?
Yeah, okay. I think you were to blame for the parentheses.
Could you? No, it's to record.
You said that you prefer to think about a contradiction as not having reasons for reject, if I understood correctly.
Yes.
Okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes, having no reasons to reject either formula, either phi or not phi.
Okay, I think it's interesting, but what I think it's a little strange in this approach is that sometimes we know nothing about several propositions. Okay, there are several propositions, a set of propositions we don't know if they are true, false, okay. And it seems to me that in this case, by default, we are going to accept all of them.
No, no.
Why?
I wouldn't attach any attitude in that case, because I think that our status is always of a partial valuation, always of a partial knowledge of the world. So I wouldn't attach either cognitive attitude to that case in which I don't know. So why should I attach a value to what I don't know? So what I'm claiming here is that the best interpretation that I have nowadays, not at the time, but nowadays for this, is that I don't quite understand what it means to know too much.
Yeah.
So I would know too little, but know too little about rejection, not too little about acceptance.
Yeah, but the
knowing too little about acceptance is the problem of para-complete logics, about intuitionistic logic.
Yeah, but the point is that we cannot know too much. Okay, if you have A and not A, it's not knowledge about A and not it's no máximo at best a belief in it. But okay.
I understand, and I used to subscribe to this. I hope you will be cured of this in the near future.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks again.